Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome each of you here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Solomon, and I serve as the Vice President for the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. And I'm thrilled to have each and every one of you here today for today's lecture as part of our Power of Diversity lecture series. As we kick off the new year and the spring semester, I'm happy to say that the Power of Diversity lecture series continues to be a platform for scholars and thought leaders, diversity professionals, and others whose work enriches the collective efforts that we share and our collective values to promote inclusive excellence on our campus. We believe that fostering an open exchange of ideas and perspectives is essential to building a more just, equitable, and compassionate community. We're thankful that you all are joining us. And we want to give a special recognition to one of our great student organizations, Tsunagari Japan, today for co-hosting this lecture. Their aim is to promote the language and culture of Japan through weekly immersion-based conversation tables, weekly discussions, and special cultural events. We also want to deeply thank our history department for their leadership and co-sponsorship of this lecture series today. Our history department has been just an incredible partner and an inspiration for today's lecture, and we truly appreciate you. We're especially honored today to welcome Dr. Junko Takeda, a historian, author, and unique blend of personal experience and scholarly expertise, and offers us really a powerful perspective on the complexities of diversity and immigration. Dr. Takeda's journey from an undocumented immigrant facing deportation hearings to a prominent scholar in early modern France and empire is one that underscores resilience, strength, and importance in amplifying diverse voices. Now, we'll learn more from her experiences, insights, and themes that she explores in her writing. She will help us begin our conversation on the broader struggle for equality and understanding. Here at Case Western Reserve University, we will continue to welcome all students consistent with our inclusive policies, our non-discrimination policies, to support them in any way that we can. We have additional information, I think, on our registration table for those who might want additional information about what we do. So at this time, I'm not going to take up a lot of time because we want to really get to the main event. I would like you to join me in welcoming Dr. Jillian Weiss from our history department, and she will introduce our guest speaker today. Let's welcome Dr. Weiss warmly.
Hello. Thank you very much to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement for their co-sponsorship of today's speaker, and also with the Department of History. I just want to particularly thank Robert Solomon and Evelyn Nunez Rodriguez, Ananya Dasgupta, and also Das Weiss for helping to organize. It's a huge privilege today to be able to welcome a colleague and also a friend, Junko Takeda. She is a graduate of Duke University. And she earned her PhD in history and the humanities at Stanford, and is currently professor of history and chair of the Citizenship and Civic Engagement Program at Syracuse. Over the past 2 decades, besides being a prize-winning academic and mentor, as well as an exemplar of an engaged academic, Professor Takeda has published a series of path-breaking articles and books about migration and revolution, globalization, citizenship, epidemic disease, ethnic violence, and empire building. And she has used, in particular, a lens of looking at interactions between France and Asia during the 17th and 18th centuries. And as you'll hear today, Professor Takeda is really interested in writing from the margins, shedding light on places and on people who are typically overlooked in historical scholarship. In her first book, for example, she examines the city of Marseille, which is France's major Mediterranean port, in the lead up to the 1720 plague that actually killed half of its population. And that was blamed on contaminated cargo coming from the Muslim majority Ottoman Empire. And traditionally, historians have paid much more attention to Paris, which is the center of France. And Marseille still has a reputation of being somewhat un-French, partly because its inhabitants have roots in large numbers in North Africa. Her second book, entitled The Other Persian Letters, examines a series of 18th century efforts to establish what she calls a French empire of trade with Safavid Iran. And here she uses a series of global micro-histories of overlooked individuals, from a Parisian madam you'll hear more about, who had a gambling house, and a Greek translator who also gambled a lot himself. And it's, she has concerns about marginalized people and places, and an approach that used microhistory to understand macro processes, which actually is also at play in two other monographs that she's writing, as well as in the memoir that you're going to hear about today. And I just want to, emphasize that the kind of history and the kind of writing and research that Professor Takeda does is very, very difficult to do. She has to piece together fragments of evidence from handwritten archival documents that she has found in archives in multiple countries. She's had to master multiple languages in order to do that. And I also want to, emphasize that the research and historical writing that Professor Takeda does has deep personal and also political relevance, especially in Trump's America. And so, as we confront this, spate of executive orders about dismantling DEI programs and deporting immigrants, removing birthright citizenship, and curtailing the rights of trans Americans, we're really lucky to have Junko Takeda with us today to help us think about the long story of marginalized people taking action and how to remain resilient today. So please join me in welcoming Junko Takeda to Case Western Reserve University.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking Professors Ananya Dasgupta and Dr. Jillian Weiss in the History Department for extending such a warm invitation to join everyone here today. And I want to thank Evelyn Nunez Rodriguez and Robert Solomon as well from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement for organizing this venue. Is this better? Organizing this venue with the diversity lecture series. And thank you also in the back to Media Visions and Best White for work behind the scenes. And thanks again to all of you for joining today. So let's see if this works. So as Dr. Weiss introduced, I am a historian of the early modern world. I study people who lived and died roughly 400 years ago, so a very long time ago. People across the Mediterranean Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean world, who interacted with representatives from the state we now know as France. Now, today, I'm not really going to be talking about those people, though. I'm going to be I'll start by sharing how my research interests in the pre-modern world were informed by much more than my training in undergraduate or graduate schools. As you can see from some of these pictures of my family, they were shaped by my personal experience with my family as undocumented immigrants, by my bi-ethnic Korean and Japanese background, and also, let's see, my Korean and Japanese background, and my family's stories of my ancestors' wartime forced migrations and displacement in the early and mid 20th century. Secondly, I'll talk about how in the last roughly 5 to 8 years, I began addressing this relationship between my personal pasts and my historical training in different ways. I'm kind of a late bloomer. After being a historian for about 20 years, I started gaining more confidence in my voice as a writer, as a teacher, as an advocate, but most importantly, my voice as an Asian American, as a first-generation immigrant and college graduate. After reaching a mid-career point, so I got tenure, I got promoted to full professor, I kind of took time off to reflect on that professional as well as personal life trajectory. I started to reflect on the embarrassing fact, not embarrassing for me, but I think embarrassing for institutions, that the reason why I was the first Asian American woman to be promoted to full professor in 2021 and become its first woman of color elected as chair this year, I'll start in a few months, in the history department in 2025, is because of structural and institutional barriers that prevent a child who once faced deportation hearings to become a professor as an adult. And I don't think this is just a Syracuse story, right? The recognition that I have a unique voice to speak and write about that journey coincided with a particular moment in American history that we all know as the political appearance of Trumpism. So I'm going to share with you some of that professional trajectory from studying French history to where I am now writing a memoir, and I'll address what it means to write about specifically being undocumented in the context of what's been going on here, not just now, but since I would say 2016. I know for many of us here today, I'd like to acknowledge that this has been an incredibly hard week. The inauguration on Monday, and now just recently in the last few days, the bipartisan support for the Anti-Immigrant Laken Riley Act has clarified once more the vulnerability of populations minoritized by lots of things, by visa status, by race, ethnicity, class, gender, and other markers of difference to a politics of fear and hate and division. But I hope today that we can remind ourselves that our collective presence here in this room, on this campus and beyond, as well as our individual stories, have the power to envision, to claim, and to forge an alternative path forward for our country, despite where we are here today. So a little bit about my personal journey through academia. So this began when I approached a professor at Duke University, not this woman here, but a different professor at Duke University as an undergraduate around 1995 to write a thesis in French history after reading her book, Natalie Zeman Davis's The Return of Martin Guerre. And this is a book about an imposter in 16th century France, a man who pretends to be someone else. This professor suggested I do Asian history instead. She asked me, why French history? I didn't listen, I was stubborn. So I ended up working with another advisor on a different French character, Alexis de Tocqueville, and his inconsistent views of race and empire. I was interested in how he was a 19th century classical liberal, and I was interested in how he could offer relatively, for that time, humane considerations and criticisms of racial tensions in the United States on his visit to the US in the 1830s, but then call wholeheartedly for the extermination of Arabs in Algeria and support its conquest. Now, behind the scenes of that interest, I had just been legalized in 1990 after having grown up for much of my childhood as an undocumented immigrant. And so in that window, I really hadn't had time to process my family's deportation hearings, for which I'd translated documents so that my parents and I could defend ourselves against the US government's arguments for our removal. And I'll be showing some pictures of those documents a little later on. Now, Asian American history at that time was not offered at Duke, and in fact, their Asian American minor studies was only inaugurated around 2018, right? So I predated this by a few decades. But I knew that I wanted to understand how Western populations interacted with foreigners, with migrants, and those really on the fringes of legality, so various types of people kind of skirting those boundaries. I was interested in how political shifts or economic interests or popular violence could harden exclusionary policies. I was interested in how minoritized people navigated those turns. So these were questions that were personally pertinent to my family in the 1980s and 1990s, and they continue, as we can see, to be central today. Now, in graduate school, those and other similar questions animated my interest in France's Mediterranean city of Marseille. And as Dr. Weiss introduced, the complex relationships between the city, its population, and Ottoman merchants and migrants. And so that became the topic of my dissertation and my first book project, and kind of placing that historically, it was in the wake of 9/11. So it was, the early aughts, right? Now, afterwards, I realized that my training as an intellectual historian had helped me to explore political ideas, so concepts like citizenship or statecraft, republicanism, and so forth, empire. But I hadn't really focused enough, I thought, on the individuals on the margins who had been forced to grapple with those ideas. And so I went back to the drawing table, I read a bunch of books. And so for my subsequent projects, I searched for inspiration in global microhistories. I have a bunch kind of showing here, global microhistories and connected histories that were appearing across the early 2000s. And they helped me develop my later projects. So they're not just French history, they're global history, they're subaltern studies, very different approaches to thinking about global microhistory and connected histories. So these were that's a selection of the kinds of works that I was starting to read to develop my book on a gambling house madam, a Greek dragoman or translator, and other unlikely characters representing French interests in Persia, that blue book over there. My project on Avedik, who was an Orthodox Armenian patriarch. He was kidnapped, he was detained for several years, and then likely murdered by the French crown in the early 18th century. And finally, also my current book project on a woman named Maria Guiomar, a multi-ethnic, she was Portuguese, Indian, or South Asian, Japanese, but also a naturalized French widow and an enslaved cook in Siam in present-day Thailand. And she successfully sued the French East India Company, so I'm writing a microhistory about her. But my interest in these kinds of protagonists who juggled multiple identities don't just derive from academic theories about decentered narratives or pre-modern racism and racecraft. My own upbringing had sensitized me to historical subjects who experienced unbelonging while navigating racialized environments. Because I came to history in a kind of unique way. I came to history after being told across my entire childhood by a father that I'll be talking about a little later, who was a stateless Zainichi Korean in Japan for over 2 decades before we faced deportation in this country, that we were kuni na shibito. That's how we saw ourselves. Kuni na shibito means people with no country. So I see my pre-modern historical projects and my family memoir writing kind of mutually informing one another. So I'm going to say a little bit about the genesis of my project, my memoir project. The idea to write my memoir, my family memoir, I should say, Undocumented, crystallized gradually across Trump, I'll say Trump round 1. After he was elected the first time, 2016, and thousands of women marched on Washington in pink hats, I initially felt uncomfortable as an Asian American woman with a complicated immigrant past to occupy what I actually felt was a largely white space, and so I held back. But when he signed his executive order shortly thereafter, banning entry to travelers and refugees from 6 Muslim majority countries, many in our sanctuary city of Syracuse mobilized. My family volunteered at resettlement programs and our city's mosque. When Breonna Taylor's and George Floyd's murders, coupled with anti-Asian hate crimes in the early months of the pandemic occurred, I found myself responding to more invitations to talk with Asian American, Asian diasporic, and BIPOC affinity groups while hate incidents ticked up upon campus at SU. So I would say that my voice kind of awakened in stages. So while this was going on campus, behind the scenes, my father's legal status became precarious again. So Trump's immigration advisor at the time, you might remember his name, is Stephen Miller, had pushed to reactivate very restrictionist public charge rules to deny green cards and H-1s and so forth. So my dad's dependence, he's working class, his dependence on Section 8 public housing, SNAP, other welfare programs, as well as his earlier deport record from my childhood, made him a target for denial when his green card expired in 2015. So I got him legal aid in Syracuse. Now, this process recalled my childhood experiences dealing with immigration lawyers, INS, deportation hearings, and all that, except this time, I was in my 40s, my dad was in his 70s, and I had an 8-year-old biracial son asking me, if Gaga gets kicked out of the country, am I going to get kicked out of the country too? So he was the age I had been when I first went into the courtroom back in 1985. And I found through my conversations that his fears, my kids' fears and his questions were echoed by many students I spoke with. And like my son, many of those students kept telling me they'd never been taught their histories. That in high school, in secondary school, they'd never been assigned books, for example, by an immigrant author or an Asian American author, Americans of Asian descent. And this was consistent with my own experiences across the 80s and 90s growing up in North Carolina. An erasure of our histories, of authors, of artists, of activists, all of us, right? So I decided to design a course on Asian American memoirs, and incidentally, it was the first course on Asian American history ever in my department. We don't have an Asian Americanist. When my son kept asking things to me like, I can't find books with Asian boys in America. Can you write one, Mommy? Or I only know about Gaga's life because of what you tell me. I can't find anything about things like that. And so the writing kind of started to appear on the wall for me because I realized that I was already acting as my family's story keeper and storyteller. And with my mom, she'd passed away back in 2006 for a while ago, my dad was aging. So I started to really feel an urgency to document and to figure out, to uncover their pasts. In the last couple of years, since I assumed leadership of SU's program in citizenship and civic engagement, it's called CCE, and dialogued with a lot of community partners, nonprofit partners, I've actually learned a lot. I kind of became a student again in that position. And I've learned that how first-person storytelling, oral histories are really critical for intersectional approaches to social justice and to advocacy work, especially among minoritized and marginalized populations who don't have their histories repositories anywhere else. So my personal life, my historical training, my responsibilities as a teacher, as a mentor, as a mother, and leadership of CCE all kind of came together to fuel this project of sharing our family's story to amplify undocumented Asian American experiences. Now, in the time I've been doing this, in the last few years, I've spoken with many undocumented students who've grown up here, who have practiced citizenship, who've been engaged without the legal privilege of citizenship. But the one kind of person I have yet to meet in over 20 years in academia is another professor who grew up undocumented like me, another professor who went to deportation hearings. And there's a structural reason for that, like I alluded earlier, right? So I realized that I have a unique privilege, but also a unique platform now that I'm naturalized, now that I am a citizen, from which I can speak and write about growing up undocumented, to humanize that experience, and to really try to complicate our understanding of what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be Asian in America. So I'm going to pivot now for the rest of our time here to the Memoir project. And instead of reading from it, I think it's actually boring to read my writing out loud. So instead of reading from it, I'm just going to kind of summarize some of its sections. I have three main parts or sections, so I kind of talk through each of them and the kinds of things that I talk about in them. So the first section opens with a secret that I kept from my elementary school teachers and classmates across my childhood, and that is the fact that we were quote unquote illegal aliens. The book starts with this number, A26-595-976. Anyone know what that is? It's an alien registration number. Every immigrant has one. And often in letters, they do not refer to us with our names. They refer to us by the A number. So that was my A number in my deportation proceedings. So I'm going to kind of talk through the next couple of minutes to explain why we were deportable, and that has a kind of long pre-story. So my parents, Takeda Kenichi, Takeda Kinuko, came to the United States from Japan with me when I was 3 in May of 1979. And the reason for this, one of the reasons for this was because for much of his adult life in between bartending, my dad had been unemployed in Japan. So I'm going to have a bunch of pictures here. And the reason why I like to have a lot of pictures here, especially when talking about undocumented immigrants, is to humanize, right, what we look like. We're not the criminals that people would like for us to think we are. So you have my mom, my dad, and myself. I'm 3 in these pictures. So when I was a toddler, my dad decided that life in Japan was leading to nothing but dead ends. And so he borrowed money from my mom. My mom was a daycare teacher. He got a tourist visa for a few weeks, and he packed a bag full of these wooden acrobat toys. My mom referred to them as pico pico. You squeeze them and then the figure turns around and around. And he flew to LA with a bunch of these toys and walked around K-Town for 2 weeks trying to sell these acrobats, and nobody bought them. But he met a guy in a restaurant in K-Town in Los Angeles who told him that he could come to the United States more successfully on a student visa, and that he could enroll in his friend Mr. Choi's English language school. And so that's what he did. After returning from his trip, the 3 of us came to LA on May the 19th, 1979. And I'll say a little bit later, but May the 19th is a very important date for my family. Now, within 2 months, Dad had quit the language class. And since Mom had taught daycare in Japan, 3- and 4-year-olds in Japan, they decided that he could get credentialed as a primary school teacher. It just takes a few months to get a certificate for Montessori training. That's what she did. And then they decided to teach together. So he got this certificate in Santa Monica, but securing a job was not easy. Because once he was no longer a student, the student visa expired. Any school that then hired them would have to sponsor a work visa so that they could remain legal. Dad got his first American job in Long Island, so we flew cross country. But when the principal realized that, A, he needed a visa, he had no New York State teaching license, he did not have a bachelor's degree, and neither did my mom, he let him go within the first few weeks. So this scenario repeated itself in Chicago and then in Charlotte, North Carolina. They would find a random employment at a daycare, a Montessori daycare, and then it wouldn't work out. So ultimately, my parents decided to become self-employed. So they incorporated their little home daycare called Sharon Montessori Daycare in 1982 with 3 students and a tuition set at $300 a month, which was $300 cheaper than white-run Montessori's because they thought that they would have to do that to attract students. So you can figure out how many dollars they were making a month. Now, with their visas expired, no employer sponsoring them, they became what my parents called moguri. Moguri means to burrow underground, so we became undocumented. So this is the school. It was the school, and it was also where I grew up. The houses here were not there. At that time, it was just a big field. And now these multi-million-dollar McMansions are basically pushing against all these older houses in Charlotte. So I spend the first part of the memoir describing my dad's 34 years and my mom's 25 years in Charlotte, North Carolina, living and working in this small house, this Montessori daycare. It was a 2-bedroom ranch rental, and they educated hundreds of kids across 3 decades. Kids who weren't academically challenged at other daycares, kids who were disabled and other schools would not accept. We had several kids with cerebral palsy, for example, who were told that they couldn't go to public school. Black and brown kids marginalized in predominantly white schools in Charlotte. Asian kids whose parents saw in my parents a more culturally understanding set of teachers, but also white kids whose parents assumed, and they would tell this to us, the white kids whose parents who assumed that a school run by Asians would produce math geniuses. So they taught, long story, they taught everyone. So I play with several themes in part 1, deportation hearings, poverty, filial piety, and what psychologists call parentification, taking on the kind of responsibilities of an adult as a child, navigating our space between a white and black racial binary in a small southern town. I share family stories about how, as working class immigrants, my parents had little in common with a small Japanese community, but they were affluent businessmen and their families in the Carolinas during Japan's bubble. So they kind of kept to themselves. I talk about the fact that the year my parents opened their school, so this was 1982, Vincent Chen was bludgeoned to death by 2 white men who took out their rage over Japan's successful auto industry on a man they thought was Japanese. I remember a classmate in 2nd grade wearing a T-shirt with the phrase, 2 bombs weren't enough, with a picture of an atomic bomb. So these were the years when Mike Masaoka, who the director of the JACL, noted, and I quote, "The U.S.-Japan relationship was at its worst since World War II." So there's a long history here, right, of anti-Asian hate. This is not just appearing out of COVID. As undocumented immigrants, we shared with many like us structural barriers against accumulating assets and accessing welfare. So the U.S. immigration laws do not consider daycare workers skilled professionals. So we've heard a lot in the news recently about the H-1 visa, right? So the H-1 visa requires proof of specialized knowledge and a 4-year college degree. My parents lacked both of those. They weren't the educated immigrants to whom another previous immigration law, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, INA, from 1965, granted kind of privileges to educated immigrants. So without legal status, they had no social security numbers. Given their low income, they didn't have any credit. They tried actually to buy that little house. They tried to mortgage 3 times, but they were rejected each time, and then they gave up. They never bought. So no accumulated wealth. The years of immigration proceedings wrecked my dad's mental health, and he stopped working and he stopped eating. My mother bled out a miscarriage immediately after our first deportation hearing. Neither of them had health insurance, primary care doctors. She didn't have a gynecologist. And actually, our health, this is in my book here, our health care was actually a book of home medicine that my mom had brought with her from Japan. It was this little black paperback book. So when any one of us would get sick, she would refer to that book. It basically became the encyclopedia of how to get better again. And I remember when I had chicken pox, that book taught my mom that you're supposed to slather sesame oil all over my body. So I smelled like a walk for weeks, and then I was made fun of at school because the smell wouldn't go away. So across my childhood, given all that, I became my mom's teaching partner, her secretary, her translator, the person who picked up the phone, cultural navigator, and confidant when she wondered what was wrong with my dad, when she worried about money, when she worried about our deportation hearings, when she worried about who was going to take care of her parents in Japan. Now, that did not stop when Ronald Reagan, signed a bill, IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, in 1986, the law that actually eventually led to our amnesty and legalization, along with 3 million other undocumented immigrants. And this is a very controversial bill. It helped people like us who had been in the States before 1981, but it then closed the door gradually and made things much more restrictive to the point where we are today. So I'm very conflicted about this law that actually helped my parents. During our immigration process, our lawyer, Alan Gordon, told me that straight A's would help prove that I belonged in this country. I was being told, consciously or not, by the adults in the room, that my family's ability to remain in the country hinged on me being a model minority, doing well in school, translating for my parents, doing the kind of work of an adult as a child. I didn't know it then, but I was parentified. So if you look up parentification, immigrant, and trauma, those 3 words just on Google, it just explodes with a lot of psychological research. So I wanted to kind of pause here and show you, these are the documents I was translating as an 8, 9, 10-year-old. Law is incredibly hard to dissect, even as an adult with a PhD or a JD, right? But of course, my parents really struggled to read and understand these documents, and so I was flipping through a dictionary, a kind of Japanese-English dictionary, to figure out how best to communicate these legal documents to my parents. And one of the things I talk about is how, words have power and words have meaning, right? And a lot of the words that I was repeating over and over, or finding repeating themselves over and over, were words like denied and revoked and deported, all these kind of negative terms. So mainstream media overwhelmingly speaks of immigration as a border policy problem to be fixed. And we hear this repeatedly now, social media as well. The conflation of undocumented with the word illegal stigmatizes all of us as criminals to be punished. There's a failure in our country to recognize undocumented immigrants' human rights. So, for example, we don't talk enough about how undocs comprise the largest group of uninsured people in the country. Anywhere from 40 to 70% don't have health coverage. They're not eligible for Medicaid, even though they pay tens of billions in taxes. And this has a human cost. My mother prematurely died at age 56 after a lifetime of no health care, no dental care, no gynecologists, no primary care, not knowing she had cancer. Minority stress shaved years off her life. She actually died the day of my job talk at Syracuse University on January the 31st, 2006. When I persuaded her, finally in the last week of her life, to go to the ER, she worried about medical debts. She told me not to come see her until my interview was done because she didn't want me to throw my future and my life away to be at her bedside. I did not make it to her in time. So this has a much longer history. I don't want to talk just about the 3 of us. I want to kind of move backwards 100 years and talk about Asians in America across the century. So Mom, Dad, and I were not the first in our family who got in trouble with the law in the United States. It's a family tradition. Across my childhood, my mom actually would often mention a great aunt and a great uncle who lived here for decades in the early part of the 20th century. And my oba-chan, who was my maternal grandmother, she still lived in Japan, would tell me that her relatives were actually always leaving Japan. One of the most successful, a far distant relative, Kawaji Toshiyoshi, had traveled to the United States and Europe with the Meiji Emperor's Iwakura mission or embassy of 1872. Here I was thinking until a few years ago that I was the first person in my family to go to France. And in fact, 150 years ago, there was this guy, Kawaji Toshiyoshi, who went to France to study Napoleonic law with the Iwakura mission. And then he came back to Japan and founded Japan's Metropolitan Police Department during the Meiji Restoration. But he was the only one who was very successful, far distant Kawaji, my grandmother's family's low-level samurai who was kind of picked up by the centralized state. Now, other much less successful Kawajis emigrated to Hawaii, Oregon, Washington State, and also South America. There's a large population, some of you may know, in South America of Japanese immigrants from the late 19th and 20th centuries. So this kind of history actually informs part 2 of my memoir. So I want to talk about 2 of these Kawaji family members. One of them, his name was Kawaji Kichiro. There's no picture of him, but he arrived in Honolulu in 1906 as a teenager from a very small farming community in southern Japan called Kaseda Kominato in Kagoshima. He arrived with $10 in his pocket. The ship records actually says what he brought with him. And he joined the sugar plantation workforce. There's a lot of historical scholarship on the sugar industry in Hawaii. And then after 10 years, it seems, of backbreaking work, he moved to Lakeview, a small ranching town and a lumber center in the Oregon outback, in kind of western Oregon. And there he opened a laundromat with his wife, a Japanese woman also from Kaseda named Ima, in the 1920s. And so I did a bunch of archiving at the Oregon State Archives as well as the Kaseda Library in Japan. And they helped me to discover an entire branch of my maternal family who had immigrated to Oregon. So according to a 1940s American census, Lake County in Lakeview, in Lake County, Oregon, had a Japanese population of 11, and they were all from my family. Out of 6,200 plus residents, there was Ima and Kichiro Kawaji, the 2 that I just spoke about, their cousin, Kosono Suyekichi, and his wife, Nakagama Sachie, and her mother, Aki, and then finally 6 American-born children. And they all lived and worked at this laundry that was apparently right in front of those 2 water towers on the outskirts of town. And that's significant. I'm going to explain why in a little bit. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor and Executive Order 9066, an FBI inspector reported that Kichiro was a Japanese naval spy. Right? He's a laundryman. So Kichiro he was worried about his family. Actually, you know what? Let me move this over. Here we go. So that's the FBI document that starts to talk about how Kawaji was in the Japanese Navy. You can kind of see that in the middle there. So they accused him of being a spy. He transferred his laundromat and his assets to his American-born nephew. He was a teenager, but they were seized anyway, so all their assets were taken away. And if my Obachan's memory can be trusted, Kichiro completely disappeared. We don't know where he went. Ima, his wife, eventually returned to Japan and lived for a period of time with my grandmother, but my grandmother told me that, quote, she lost her mind, unable to readapt to Kaseda after 30 years in Oregon. In terms of what else happened to that family branch, at that time, 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were incarcerated, but they were actually on the other side of the militarized zone, so they did not go into the camps. And the 3 teenage boys, the Nakagama boys, enlisted in the segregated Japanese American infantry, the 442nd, and fought on the Italian front. It's the most decorated infantry in American history to this day. One was wounded, but they all made it back. And after the war, they resettled because they had nothing left in Oregon. They resettled in Utah, in Salt Lake City. And then by the 60s and 70s, they ended up in Los Angeles. And they actually lived down the road from us, it turned out, when I looked at the archival records. But when we lived in Los Angeles, we had no idea that they even existed. I just found out last year. So I can't help but reflect here, to pause, on the parallels in the Kawaji story, the Nakagama story, and my parents' stories and their relevance to the present. All of them operated family-run businesses because employment was closed off to them. You know, Oregon and California had a lot of restrictive laws as to what kind of jobs they could have and not have. They couldn't hold property, for example. They provided undervalued labor as cleaners and daycare teachers. They faced dispossession. They faced deportation. They didn't have the right to vote. My dad still cannot vote. He never will. These stories are not unique to my family. 1.7 million undocumented immigrants currently are Asian in America. A quarter of them live under the poverty line. So if we look combined across ethnicities and class, the numbers really fly against the stereotype that Asian immigrants are a racial bourgeoisie characterized and privileged by proximity to whiteness. A lawyer, Mari Matsuda, has urged we need to amplify first-person narratives and histories of Asians who've struggled against unjust American laws in the past and in the present, and build solidarity with similarly marginalized Black and Latinx immigrants of color, like authors like Kathy Park Hong, Jose Antonio Vargas, and many others have started to do. So in the last portion of my talk here, I want to return us to the far past, but now segue to Korea and Japan, because in the third part of the memoir, I talk about what I learned when I was in elementary school. I was actually 9 years old when I learned that my dad was not Japanese. This was a secret he kept from me for 9 years. I learned also at the time at the dinner table that his name was not Kenichi Takeda. I learned that dad was born to Korean migrants Sopangiru in Yunguksen in Japan in 1945. And I'll explain why he held this secret. So Korea had come under Japanese rule in 1910. Settlers despoiled indigenous farmers and took half of Korea's arable land. The imperial government drafted 500,000 Korean forced laborers to support Japan's industrialization and war efforts. And in the meantime, millions more Koreans migrated voluntarily, but that's a sticky word, most as day laborers because their lands were taken away. So by the war's end, 2.4 million Koreans lived in Japan. After World War II, about 1 million of them repatriated, but over 650,000, including my dad's family, stayed in Japan because there was no home to return to. They remained stateless until 1965, when Japan finally recognized South Korea. And they, like other Koreans in Japan, or they called Zainichi Koreans in Japan, they were ordered to apply for South Korean citizenship or remain stateless, even though many of them had never been or seen South Korea. My dad was actually born in Japan, but there's no birthright citizenship. That's in the news a lot right now. So my dad got his Korean passport in his 20s without ever having been to his ethnic homeland. But that same passport then excluded him from work opportunities in Japan. So across the 50s, 60s, 70s, laws actually forbade Zainichi Koreans. Basically, that's just a term that means Koreans who had been residing in Japan since the empire. They were forbidden from government jobs, public jobs, and professional jobs. My mom was a public school daycare teacher. He could not have been a public daycare school teacher with a Korean passport. The law that forbade non-citizens from high-earning professions was only struck down in 1977 in Japan, a year after I was born. Zainichi Koreans only received permanent resident status opportunities in 1981 when I was 5. Bi-ethnic children of Japanese mothers, so Korean father, Korean born in Japan father, Japanese mother like myself, were only allowed citizenship in 1985. Forced fingerprinting was still around until 1993. And like I said, no birthright citizenship yet. So how did all of that impact my own family? So my grandfather, Sopangiru, he was born 100 years ago in 1923. He spent 16 years in Cheonghup. These are pictures from Cheonghup in Jeollabuk-do, which is in the south of South Korea. And all of this I really learned recently. I didn't know any of this history, this family history, until last year. My dad didn't even know. I took my dad on his first trip to Korea last year on the 100th birthday anniversary of his father, Seo Pang-gil, and I learned that they were actually a well-to-do family. Property records showed that they lived in a hanok-style house. A hanok is a traditional wooden Korean house. It's very flat but wide. They had a hanok-style house on a large plot near the town center, and that's where we're standing. It's now a sushi restaurant, which I think is ironic. It's a sushi restaurant and a car fix, an auto fix shop. So all of that used to be this flat Hanok-style house, and the property records indicated that that's where their family had been. His families were also leaders in a Catholic community supported by French missionaries who had established a town church there in 1917. So I thought this was all interesting as a French historian, again, learning that, there were members of my Japanese family who had been to Japan and members of my Korean family who had interacted with French priests in Korea in the early part of the century. So my grandfather was educated in Confucian classics at a suwon. A suwon is kind of a calligraphy philosophy educational facility, like the one you see here in his town. His calligraphy was actually impeccable, and he had wanted to become a magistrate. But by his childhood, the Japanese had come in, they'd renamed the province from Jolabukdo to Zendo Hokudo, and they appropriated it for potato farming, potato and rice farming, and they created a huge dam and they flooded the plateau above the town so that they could irrigate the fields. They displaced thousands. And so my grandfather and his two brothers arrived in Japan shortly after this happened in the 1920s and early 30s, and they became coal workers and construction workers in Fukui, Japan. After the war, they were stranded with no legal status, and my grandpa continued dabbling in construction, but then started serving ramen and barbecue from food carts. So he was a food cart seller. His brother was killed when he and his food cart were struck by a car, and my grandmother, who was bedridden with tuberculosis, died at age 38. A former professor at Syracuse University, Richard E. Kim, has written a book where he explores the Japanese Empire's forced assimilation policies. He has an autobiographical memoir called Lost Names. And I pick up on this theme in my own memoir. I talk about the psychological impact of my dad losing his name. So I talked about forced assimilation, right? They were not able to learn Korean language. They were not able to have Korean names. So my dad's father, Seo Pang-gil, became Oshiro Hidekichi. That was the only name I knew him as for a very long time. My dad's mom, Oshiro Kikue. And then their children, So Sokujo, So Kinjun, So Sokushin, those are all Korean names. They became Kenichi, Kyoko, and Shinichi Oshiro. But they used their Korean names at home for the first few years. Now, at age 7, my dad's dad told him that life would be easier if he entirely became Japanese, and he packed him off with his siblings to a Catholic Salesian orphanage run by Japanese and European missionaries. And we visited there last year. This is my dad right here. That's my dad there in the baseball hat, and my dad there as well. And then that's the orphanage. It's a totally different building, but I took him to that orphanage last year. This childhood made it impossible for my dad to complete college. He became a bartender instead at the Foreign Correspondence Club in Tokyo in the 1970s, but this opened up a whole new world for him. This was a place where journalists, civil rights leaders, performers, and global elites poured into Asia during the Vietnam War. Being in the orbit of people like Walter Cronkite and Pete Seeger, Dad became interested in civil rights, and he actually wrote to Martin Luther King. The letter from King to my dad is pictured there. He also met an activist and folk singer who marched with King. Some of you might know her name, Odetta Gordon. And she became a surrogate mother to my dad after my grandmother died, and she was kind of grandma to me because I didn't have a grandma in this country. And he picked up the guitar. So music has been a thread across my dad's life, his therapy, and his way of communicating what he couldn't speak. And it was actually Odetta who suggested that we immigrate to the United States. So there's a lot more to talk about with my memoir, but I'm going to stop there and kind of try to wrap things up. Like I said in my intro, I started writing my family memoir, like many other Asian American authors, when BLM, when anti-Asian violence and COVID led us to reflect on a racial reckoning. They've led us in conversation about how white supremacist thinking that historically divided people of color taught immigrants, like Asians, to absorb anti-Blackness and internalize myths of so-called model minorities. We've increasingly seen this white supremacy rear its ugly head strongly. So I think it's imperative that we build on the work of these authors, many who are younger than I am, who are loudly and proudly highlighting our intersectional identities. And I think they're way ahead of me. For me, it's been very much a learning and unlearning process. I grew up with Asian parents who linguistically struggled with English, who encouraged me to keep my head down, to keep quiet, who spent their lives hiding their visa status, their bi-ethnic marriage, dad's Korean identity out of shame. So self-effacement was baked into me as a child. And as a historian, I've been trained also to avoid the I in writing, right? We don't often write in the first person. So historical writing has been comfortable for me as it kind of aligns with my own childhood growing up. But memoir writing has been a completely different experience. Another challenge of memoir writing that I want to leave you with, there's a professor at Stanford, Richard White, who wrote a memoir himself called Remembering a Hanagram. And in this memoir, he says that a memoir is a collaboration between the author and their family who provide their memories. But the historian also challenges memories to analyze their veracity and to think about them in broader context. So I found that as much as I want to amplify my dad's voice or resurrect my mom's voice, I'm uncomfortable with their narratives of how they moved here so I could have a better life. That I'm, especially for my mom, that I'm her dream realized. I wouldn't be able to write this without them, but as much as I began this project to unsilence my parents and document their undocumented pasts, I've also found that articulating my own voice comes at a cost of questioning theirs. So I think writing a memoir for an Asian American like myself is an act of filial piety on one hand, but it's also its opposite. So I'm kind of grappling with that right now. So these are a bunch of authors that I would recommend. You've probably read some of them or are familiar, but they're some of the ones that I assign in my memoir class. Since I began sharing that I became interested in history after reading a book about a 16th century French imposter, I want to conclude with the theme of ethnic imposter syndrome. So an imposter, as you know, is someone who pretends to be someone with a purpose of deceiving. My dad has 4 names and 4 identities. Sosokujo, the Korean boy, became Oshiro Kenichi, a made-up name. Then Takeda Kenichi, and then Ken Takeda, not to deceive, but to survive. He became Takeda Kenichi when he married my mother. That's my mother's maiden name. Yoshi is a Japanese practice of adult adoption that secures a family's matrilineal succession when the bride is an only child. My mom was an only child. And when the bride is of higher status than the grooms. Hers was of higher racial, ethnic status. As an immigrant to the United States, people told my dad Kenichi was too hard to pronounce, and so he became Ken Takeda. When I asked him last year if he considered himself Japanese ever in his life, he answered never. How about Korean? He kind of paused and didn't want to answer that question. He said, Koreans don't consider Zainichi Koreans as Koreans. Koreans in Japan. I asked, American? He said no. I asked if he thought of ever using his real name ever. And he's told me, Sosokujo doesn't exist anymore. Kuni na shibito. people with no country. So Dad suffered a series of strokes last February. He's developed aphasia, so his English is barely existent now. He can't afford assisted living, so I am his caretaker. His days are spent at PT and at St. Anthony's, a church where he plays guitar at the Latine Mass. Last year, when I talked about the election results, he kept repeating in Japanese, kyosei sokan, Japanese word for deportation. But then he lit up and he said the words, Han seishin irune, Japanese sentence for we need our Han spirit. Anyone heard of Han spirit? Han is a post-colonial Korean concept. It's a mishmash, it's a complicated word to describe, but it's basically resistance and resilience bound up with sorrow, anger, grief, basically just anger towards injustice, right? And it really gained currency between the Japanese occupation and the Korean War and the dictatorship. Dad might say Sosokujo doesn't exist, and with his worsening dementia, he barely talks. But I'd like to think that Sosokujo's Han spirit is still there. And given what the world faces right now, I think Han spirit burns in many of us too, and that we can claim belonging in a country, this one, without feelings of impostrature. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We want you to stay there. Turn this on for a moment so you can hear me. But we're so thankful for just that incredible story. We want to give an opportunity for any of you who have questions. We're going to put the microphone here. You can approach it and you can share any questions that you have about this incredible story. And I'll start. One is I thought it was powerful that you talked about the stories that we have, and I think there's certainly harm in a single narrative story.
Right.
That I think that it makes it easier to try to group people into one narrative story, and I think that you have illustrated to us that our stories can be very complex, and they shed so many different lights. There's a lot of things I can talk about, but I won't say too much. So. Can you share with us why you feel it is so important for us to break away from the single narrative or the box that we might be put in and to really share an authentic story that's more complex?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that question.
Please just line up and come ask any questions.
I absolutely agree that it's essential to make complex our stories. And even in a family, I mean, I'm telling the story of a single family, right? It's a micro history of a family. But even there, the stories are multifaceted and complicated, right? And I actually I'm uncomfortable with the kind of category of Asian American writer. Because I think, Asian American itself and historians and scholars kind of dissect that term, right? What do we mean by Asian Americans? Because it's in many ways a category that oversimplifies, and it's made up, and it was made in a particular context, a political context in the 1960s, and it erases some people who might be Asians in America in itself, right? So I think kind of questioning those categories themselves, like Asian American, right, and also questioning these single narratives are really essential to provide that more intersectional understanding of who we are and what brought us here. Yeah.
Right, don't be shy.
Hi, my name is Sneh. Thank you for sharing your story. I was curious if you would talk more about, you talked about your training as a historian, or like your tendency as an historian to not talk about the I or like remove yourself in that way. And then like your experience, reflecting and writing your memoir, like what that process has been like for you, and if it's like done anything for you, like has it been uncomfortable to like center yourself like that? And then like what's that process been like, and what has it given you, if anything?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. I guess it's been a long process. I've gone through multiple iterations of this. I'm not finished with the memoir project yet. I have to finish it by July-ish. And it's gone through multiple iterations because first I didn't want it to be about me at all. I wanted it to be about my parents and my grandparents and other people, right? But then I was comparing what I was writing and how I was writing to some of these memoirs that I assign in class, right? And realized that in order for a reader to kind of empathize and understand and walk with the narrator has to be there, right, in a memoir. And so I kind of threw the first draft away, restarted it, because I started originally with a story about my parents, and now it's a story, I start with the A number, right? I start with my deport number. But that took multiple steps. But I think the other way I can answer that question is by saying that it's kind of informed the way I write my historical microhistories, right? When I wrote my earlier books and my earlier projects, they were very much more kind of a bird's eye view perspective on what was going on in Marseille and so forth. And I didn't really talk much about the individuals. And so that kind of reflexive realization that I have to really focus on the individual, including myself, has led me to my microhistory projects, where I do that in the historical writing as well. So I don't know if that answers some of your questions, but yeah, thanks.
Hello, my
Hi.
name is Isaac Anaya,
Hi, Isaac.
and I really appreciate the talk. And one thing that has really inspired me, hearing you speak on your family and your history and the work you've been doing, is particularly the way you use language, and whether I have not read it myself, but if there was any words that you feel like it doesn't exemplify. You mentioned the word with like hope, but it's like struggle and pain and despair, and that's like, how do you use different languages in your text to express different feelings?
Yeah.
And how does that like either help your writing process or like how does that help your writing process?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. The language question is such an important one, especially when you're talking about an immigrant family who speaks in that language, right? So at home, I speak in Japanese with my parents, or that's how I grew up. I didn't speak in English. And so in my own memories and in my own recollections, I remember things in Japanese, right? And then kind of going through the process in the writing process, then to translate it, there are just some things I can't translate. And so, when like kuni nachibito, right? A person with no country, but it's also kind of laced with other meanings in there. Han spirit, the one you were referring to, right? So I put them in there in the writing in the hopes that they don't distract from the reading by someone who doesn't have access to that language, right? But in a way to show that I'm kind of grappling with the challenges of what's lost in translation, so to speak. There's one chapter it's kind of a funny chapter because, I have all these kind of dark stories. And so I try to mix it with some of the, things were terrible, but we were also a normal family, right? We were laughing and we were joking and we were doing silly things. And so I like to insert some of those stories as well. And so one chapter is just a bunch of us talking about a bunch of Japanese idioms that don't exist in English. And they're funny, right? I'll share one if I can think of one. When you're basically like, when things are horrible and you can't do anything about it, there's a Japanese phrase that's basically be stoic as a fish on a sashimi cutting board. You're about to get chopped up, right? But don't flip around with your tail and just like remain stoic. It's there's a Japanese phrase for that, right? So I have all these Japanese phrases, and I go back and forth between the English and the Japanese. But I'm still struggling with that because, if my readers are primarily not Japanese speakers, then, what does that mean, right? In terms of the ability to communicate that what's lost in translation. So thank you for that question.
Hi, my name is Summer.
Hi.
I really resonate with a lot of what you're saying. I'm really interested in my family history. My parents are 1.5 generation coming here when they were kids. And like finding that my great uncle was a paper son and having great grandparents with bound feet. So I just find it really interesting how you're looking for stories. But as someone who's really interested in Asian American history, I find that I'm very limited by classes or resources in doing research. And I also find that I'm very frustrated, not only by lack of resources and research, but also the ignorance of people on just basic basic facts such as Japanese incarceration. Many Americans still don't know about it. How do you combat that frustration of ignorance of people, and also seeing parallels of history today, such as I mentioned Angel Island using medicine to restrict immigration into the United States and undocumented immigrants in that way?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Thank you for that. So there's a lot going on here, right? There's a lack of resources, like you're saying. The challenges in finding even your family histories, right? Ignorance, all that. So I can kind of talk about some of these. For the lack of resources, this has been a really big challenge for me. One of the challenges is that many of the people that I write about that I would have loved to interview are dead, right? My mom is gone, my grandparents are gone, and so I'm very limited to my dad, whose memory is declining, and also to his brother and sister, and they're in Japan, and so this is all via, phone and so forth. So there's limited oral histories, right? But I think, with those, what I do is I approach that head on and make that a topic in the memoir, right? Why is it hard to write about? Because not only are the documents missing or the memories themselves fractured, but how much can we rely on memories anyway? Because memories are always shifting and changing, right? So I kind of talk about memories and oral histories as a challenge in and of themselves, and how do we deal with that, right? So I make that a subject and not just make that a weakness for the project. In terms of the parallels, right? There are multiple, like you're saying, Angel Island. I mean, in my Asian American history class, I talk about the plague of San Francisco in the first decade of the 20th century, right? I think you're referring to that as well, right? When quarantines were targeting Chinese especially, and Chinese Americans, very reminiscent of COVID, right? And so the reason why I decided to do my memoir as a 3-part memoir and kind of toggle between the past and the present is precisely to show those parallels, right? My story might have taken place in the 80s, right? But there are kind of traces of similar things that happened in the 1920s. And these are things that happened in North Carolina or in Oregon, but similar kinds of things in other particular contexts were happening in Jolabukto, right? So to kind of, and I think that connects to your ignorance question, because I think I have multiple audiences that I'm grappling with, right? There's audiences of people, of readers who can relate to myself and resonate, like you were saying. But I think there's also an educational kind of goal as well for non-Japanese, non-Korean, what have you, right? Non-affinity group readers, right? And not just people who are ignorant, right? But who want to know, who don't have other sources and who are interested, who are curious, right? So I think that's also what I'm grappling with. But the more we have these stories and the more we can share, like a lot of the books that I was highlighting there, to confront that ignorance. And I think that we can kind of think about the same thing, not just for Asian Americans and of course all these different groups, but also for undocumented immigrants. We have no books about, very few, right? Jose Antonio Vargas's book is fantastic if you're interested. He is an undocumented immigrant, but he's a Filipino, a journalist in America who's very much an American by all other, right, metrics except the legal one. And the book is called Undocumented Citizen because he's problematizing our concepts of citizenship, right? So I think the more we have books like this that really showcase that to confront the ignorance, it's an important thing.
Thank you so much. Hi,
Hi.
my name is Danielle.
Danielle.
First, just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your story. As a fellow, Asian American, daughter of immigrants, really resonated with me, and especially being in a social justice space. And, I also struggle with not seeing that. So
Yeah.
seeing you, sharing your story and being someone who kind of defies those cultural expectations of keep your head down that we've learned from our native countries, all this political violence, as well as the model minority myth. So thank you. And my question is, as you're writing your memoir and you've done so much research on your own history, and you've kind of discovered these facets of your own family's hidden identities, and with your father's hidden Korean identity, how has that kind of impacted and shaped your own perception of yourself as you grapple with these various identities, Japanese, Korean, American?
Yeah. Wow. That's a powerful question. Thank you. It's a work in progress. It's constantly shifting, and I think what's particularly challenging but rewarding but painful, all the big feelings, right, about writing right now is that I'm writing while things are changing every day, right? Personally, with my dad's physical situation, his mental situation, politically, with all this stuff swirling around us, right? And so kind of processing all those in real time and then figuring out what to say. I think anyone here who's written creatively or who's written a book, knows, writing is such a process. And the book is kind of an artificial end in the sense that, it's one moment, right? That you decide now this is it and it's going to be published, but the ideas are constantly going to be morphing since from then as well. So that would be what's been really challenging, right? In terms of my own perception of my identity, I didn't know that I was Korean, right? I wasn't given that opportunity, and it was because my dad was so ashamed, and he was told as a child, don't be Korean, be Japanese, life is easier for you. So he's so internalized that anti-Korean, right? And some of us do that in America as well, right? We absorb that kind of white supremacist anti whatever you are, right? To believe that you're inferior, right? And then that colors so many decisions and actions and so forth. So that has been kind of inherited. I think that's part of generational trauma, right? And I certainly inherited that for a long time, and it's taken many years of kind of actively engaging with the violence that it does. And so that's why, kind of going back to the talk and my own kind of evolving as a historian, to me, the Natalie Davis, piece on imposterture and imposters, it's not about imposter syndrome, but that's how I kind of, right, piggybacked on that, has been a really useful way for me to think about, identity and the shaping of identity and what you're comfortable being and what you're uncomfortable being, what you're projecting to other people and so forth. So you can ask me again later and I probably have a different answer, but it's definitely a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing your background as well.
Hi, my name is Selena.
Hi, Selena.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I honestly kind of had a similar question, so I'm trying to, I guess, think of a follow-up. I guess just sort of with being elected, as you said, the first Asian American woman to be on where you are at Syracuse, right? Kind of how that helped with you finally feeling like, okay, now I have this seat at the table. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
Or if you even felt like there's something you had to do in this position and where that came from, I guess, if you could explain that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I'm actually very uncomfortable in that position. It's a work in progress, right? I think it's not something, often people, when you say something like, oh, I was the first X, right? It's like, congratulations. And it's not a congratulations, I mean, it's like, why this late, right? Why now? Why is it 2021? Why is it 2025? And I think we can say that for people of many different backgrounds, right? Whether it's women, whether it's whatever, right? Whether it's African American, whether it's Latinx, the first X, right? I think, so, on one hand, it's a congratulations, you broke the glass ceiling, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's a lot behind that, right? And I also, and this kind of goes back to my discomfort, I think, with being a kind of model minority, because in many ways, my story is a model minority story on the surface, right? It's like, here's a person who wasn't even allowed to be in this country, and here I am, a professor. I mean, that tracks, right? But I'm very uncomfortable inhabiting that kind of title or that category, because I think it does a lot of damage and it does a lot of violence. So I think, even if I inhabit that space, I try to be critical about it. And again, going back to your question, right, about the single narrative, that one person's success doesn't mean check that off the list, and now we're fine, and Obama was president, yay, now look where we are here, right? So it's I think it's something to be like, wow, that occurred, but what is that actually more indicative of institutionally, structurally, right? What are the shortcomings that led to that, as opposed to that person, did well or something?
Thank you so much. Very well said.
Thanks.
We have time for one more question, if there are any more. I know that some people might want to talk to Dr. Takeda individually, so we do want to leave that opportunity as well. I would just like to thank you so much for sharing the information, sort of kind of closing opportunities. Please feel free to please fill out your evaluation of the program, because that helps us to plan for the future and to have more incredible speakers who will come and share their stories. I want to remind everyone that tomorrow is our MLK convocation. Our speaker is Valerie Jarrett, the CEO of the Obama Foundation, which will be at 12:45 tomorrow, even if you didn't sign up. Show up, and I'm sure there'll be a seat for you there, so we encourage you to participate with that. And I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll let that be it, and then we'll let everyone come up. And this is, and I thought about your comment about parentification, right? Mm-hmm. And I won't share someone else's story, but I did hear a colleague share with me a reflection of starting college and having to translate for her parents about what was being shared at orientation. Mm-hmm. And so it reminded me of our obligation as an institution. So I wonder if you might share any insights that you've gleaned as a professor at Syracuse and your academic work are things that we can do to be more supportive of those who might be, second generation, and they're going through, documented or not,
right,
but they're dealing with those transitions. So if you close on those thoughts,
sure.
And then we'll turn it over to everyone else.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. It's such an important one, I think. I think I'm going to say two.
I'm sorry, I forgot that there are refreshments over there, so we do want to encourage people to partake.
I can smell it.
We don't want anything to go to waste, right? Anything else? Okay, all right. Yes, please.
I think I'll say two things in response to your question. The first is absolutely there. What I kind of put that under, because I talked to lots of students, but also staff, lots of faculty, especially younger faculty, junior faculty, as our institutions become more diverse. And one of the areas in which I've talked about parentification is invisible labor, right? And I think this can also get folded into kind of conversations where we've been talking about caretaking and so forth since COVID as well, where that conversation's kind of expanded. That many of us behind the scenes might be caretaking for an immigrant with visa status issues or with linguistic challenges or with healthcare challenges and so forth, right? And so at my university, I guess I don't know about other places, but I know for ours, our DEIA dean of the Maxwell School began, with our annual review processes, for example, created another section for invisible labor so that can be acknowledged, if not acknowledged, at least seen, right? And I think there's a lot of steps before acknowledgement, and then in terms of what needs to change structurally and institutionally to support people who are carrying that kind of load. But I think that can also be extended not just towards faculty, but also staff and students and so forth. So kind of an institutional understanding as opposed to just a personal one where it's up to the professor or so-and-so to be like, oh, I'll grant you leeway because you're dealing with a situation or something like that, right? To have a framework, I think, is really important. And I think kind of connected to that, what I would end with is just to acknowledge the kind of work that offices such as yours does, because people like me, people who come in and do these talks, this is just like a one-off, I give representation and I give a space so that we can talk about these things. But the really hard work is the hard work that's done on the ground, that's behind the scenes, that's every day, that's supporting immigrants, students, of color, et cetera, deal with the day-to-day issues. So I wanted to, hats off to you and your office, and especially in this environment when I know that DEIA, programs and institutions and so forth are being threatened, that, hopefully we can support as much as possible. So thank you.